When it comes to the genre of landscape art, waterfalls are perhaps one of the most beautiful and interesting subject matters for drawing. And that is because learning how to represent water in these various ways, whether it is rushing water or settled water, we have that opportunity to do so within a waterfall drawing. Furthermore, we also get the opportunity to understand how to contextualize a waterfall scene by the surrounding environment and features, and ultimately providing us with a great opportunity to practice our drawing techniques, shading styles, and ultimately how to represent features in a realistic way. With that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics. And in today's video, we will be looking at how to draw a waterfall in a really fun and simple way. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now you'll find with any landscape drawing, the intention is to always build up the scenario or the scene through your tonal values, starting from lighter sketches and kind of lighter tonal values, and then ultimately developing that not only into a more realistic representation of the various features, but we will find that we do so by building up the various tonal values within our landscape drawing, and inevitably that will result in a more realistic representation of the scene that we are drawing. So we're going to start by lightly sketching the waterfall scene. So we want to start by drawing a horizontal line along the page. Now you need to ensure that the horizontal line is slightly higher and placed in the upper section of the page so that there is more space below the horizontal line. So this is going to kind of create a nice partition between the upper section of the landscape and the lower section. From there, we want to start to lightly sketch a space that will demarcate where the waterfall will be drawn. And by doing this, we will also demarcate how large the waterfall will be in scale. So that's really up to you in terms of how large you'd like your waterfall to be. But from there, we now want to start lightly contextualizing the waterfall scene at this point already by drawing some rocks on either side of the waterfall. So remember, everything is relative in scale, which means that we want to consider how large different elements will be within the waterfall landscape in comparison to the actual waterfall itself. So the intention is to definitely spend time on this early sketch with the intention or the aim to kind of set out the scale of the scene in terms of how large the waterfall or the body of water itself will be. And as we sketch out features surrounding the waterfall, we can now extend the lower body of water out towards either side of the page, and by doing so we start to bring the settled body of water towards the foreground. So the idea is that settled body of water will kind of fall below the horizon line, and as it kind of extends outward towards the bottom corners of the page, we start to see how it starts to kind of enlarge and represent this quality of moving towards the foreground. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to already start to integrate some shading and line work in different features. So as you slowly add a light sketch of various features into the waterfall drawing, you can play around with some light shading to bring more structure to them. Now the rocks in particular are an important part because of their structure, and again we want to consider how large they will be in comparison to the waterfall and the surrounding environment. So this means we want to know the shading or kind of already start to represent the shading quality on the rocks, and this is because the detailing on the rocks itself is also a great way or a great indicator in terms of how large they are in terms of the perspective from which we are viewing them. So the utility of line work is really important for different features. So for instance, we can use diagonal lines to establish rock forms, whereas horizontal lines are a great way to emphasize a more flattened stillness in the settled water at the bottom of the waterfall. So right now what we're trying to do is we're trying to already play around with shading and line work to kind of define the general detailing within these various features. And this is where we already start to think about these various features and how they are formed in nature. So when it comes to a body of water, we'll find that as it becomes more still as opposed to a more rushing water, we are dealing with a horizontal kind of way of integrating detailing and line work as the water kind of falls still and flat on a horizontal plane. So that's the idea. So with the falling water itself, we want to be very gentle and precious as we add in more vertical line work to establish the vertical movement within the water. So we do just want to think about these natural qualities and features in terms of how they are forming within an environment, whether they fall on a horizontal plane or in the case of falling water, naturally it will create more vertical-like lines and details, and that's what we want to think as we slowly integrate and refine these different features. So as you slowly refine different features with some shading and line work, you start to establish the different surfaces and textures within the waterfall drawing. Now we should take time on working out the different features and their formations with some light shading and line work, and we also want to establish the foundations and the guidelines for some darker shading later on. So do take your time. With the falling water, again, we do want to work cautiously with some vertical line work. We want to establish both highlights and shadows in the falling water by strategically using line work and negative space. So we will find that with the falling water, negative space tends to be quite important, because when water falls in kind of this rushing formation in a downward direction, and this allows water to kind of bubble up in a very aggressive manner, which ultimately creates this bubbling effect, and that tends to be quite lighter in tonal value to that of still water that is reflecting the environment around it. So the idea of thinking about using negative space already at this point is a very strategic choice in terms of creating that very bubbling, rushing and crashing type of water near the bottom section of the waterfall, where the water crashes downwardly. So we do want to establish both highlights and shadows in the falling water by strategically using line work and negative space. With the settled water at the bottom of the waterfall, we want to utilize horizontal line shading, and this is a little different. So we do want to kind of represent that more still-like quality that falls on a horizontal plane, and that is kind of the distinction between settled water and rushing water. With the surrounding rocks, we also want to continue sketching the different rock formations, and don't be afraid to kind of zigzag your lines in all sorts of directions to create a more textural quality in these various rock formations. But then again, the idea is to really consider various features within your waterfall drawing. But otherwise, guys, the intention is to just take your time before we move on to adding more features for context. So you just want to have this general light sketch of your actual setting and scene, and kind of trying to establish some contextualizing features by working them around the waterfall to establish scale, which will ultimately help you to define how large the surrounding features or the other surrounding features should be. Now we can start to use our lightly shaded waterfall sketch as a general setting, so we can now add more features. So for instance, we can start to again add in some more rocks near the settled water area, and this is where we can start to actually play around with how we integrate other details. So the intention is to also start to think about how scale in terms of how features will be placed in the background in comparison to that of the foreground will change in scale. So for instance, naturally, because we are adding features to the top of the waterfall that seems slightly further in the distance, they'll be slightly smaller, whereas features that kind of start to come towards the foreground will be slightly larger. So a good suggestion is to also add embankments along the side of the stream at the bottom of the waterfall, so we can also start to be more strategic with scale by establishing new features within the midground as well. By establishing new features and scaling them in different ways, we start to establish depth within the waterfall drawing. So ultimately, we are drawing a landscape, and therefore should be mindful of scale between the background, midground and foreground, and how they change in size with these various features. Now with the waterfall itself, again, we also want to be strategic with leaving some negative space in the area where the falling water meets the still water, and again, by doing so, we start to create a crashing water-like effect within the waterfall. So we can also start to establish features along the upper section of the horizon line. Once again, we can start to think a little bit more creatively about our features, so we can start to maybe integrate some trees and even think about the sky behind the trees. So you do want to once again consider the scale of these various features and how they'll be different in size according to where they're placed between the background, the midground and the foreground. We can also add another embankment to the waterfall drawing, but by this time we can make it slightly larger within the foreground, and by doing this we further the three-dimensional quality of the actual waterfall drawing. Now we're going to start to enhance features with some contrasted shading, and at this point we should have established the waterfall scene, allowing allowing us to add in features and create contrast with some darker shading. Now this is especially useful for creating different textures within the falling and settled water specifically. So obviously with a waterfall drawing, we want to be conscious of the different types of water that we are dealing with. We can also draw features larger that sit within the foreground as well. That's another thing to take note of, but this is a great opportunity to also draw maybe something like a beautiful tree or a rock formation, or whatever you like. But you do want to remember that whatever you do draw in the foreground is going to be in focus and a little bit more detailed, as it is kind of obviously closer to our vantage point and the way in which we are seeing the settings. So whatever sits in the foreground should be quite detailed, and that's where you can really consider the type of feature you would like to draw in a more realistic and detailed way. Now when it comes to the water, we want to, and that's where you can consider what kind of feature you would like to draw in the foreground in a really detailed kind of way. Now when it comes to the water, we first want to darken the water that is settled below the waterfall, the settled water, the water that is still. And that again is going to be very different to the falling water, which will be slightly lighter. So once again, by doing this, we give a reflective quality to the settled water and a rushing effect to the falling water. Another thing to do is to also make sure you keep your line work and shading pretty horizontal for the settled water. Once again, because the water has become more still, it starts to sit on a horizontal plane, and by nature of that, as we integrate these marks to represent that, we want to keep them kind of going in this horizontal direction. Now as we kind of continue with this process and we can slowly start to add more features as we go, at this point we should be aware of how to enhance features with some shading and line work. Again, the way in which we give three-dimensionality or represent shadow formations is through the integration of shading. So as we add more features as we go, thinking about how shading represents shadow is obviously really important in terms of how we kind of define those qualities and details within our rock formation, and how that differs to how shadow is represented in another type of element such as water. Another important note to remember is that we can also keep any features such as mountains that might sit in the far background fairly light. So once again, you can really play around with how you integrate features at this point. By doing this, we can create the effect of distance as well, making the features less distinct in the distance is a great way to enhance three-dimensionality and depth within your landscape drawing. But otherwise, continue adding in more features as you please, ensuring that you take note of the scale for the background, midground, and the foreground. Now remember to utilize different shading styles to establish different qualities for these various features. So emphasize the falling water with vertical line work and enhance the rocks by the use of various tonal values, and thinking again about the actual textural qualities of these various features. Once again, when it comes to the rushing water, we are trying to emphasize this quality of reflection both in the falling and settled water. However, for the falling water, it does tend to be more vertical, but with the settled water that becomes more still as it comes towards the foreground, it tends to be more in a horizontal type of fashion. So make sure that you work on the details within the foreground, as well as this is an essential part of creating a more realistic waterfall drawing as well. Remember, waterfall isn't just a waterfall in isolation. What we are trying to do is create a immersive landscape with the contextualizing and surrounding features as well to enhance our waterfall drawing. Now we're going to continue to adding in more final details to the waterfall. So take a moment to work on the rushing water, and this is where we can actually spend some time on the actual water components of our waterfall drawing. So the idea is to really spend some time on the rushing water by using both pencil and an eraser to create some sort of negative strokes and add in some line work. Remember, we are trying to keep kind of a larger negative space within the bottom section where it crashes into the settled water, and by doing so we represent the crashing water, which tends to be much lighter to that of still water. Now remember to make sure you keep the crash at the bottom of the waterfall light, which will create the effect of crashing water, and use your eraser to create vertical streaks in the falling water as well. So try to erase any unnecessary marks in the crashing water if need be. The idea is that you can also add in some negative strokes with your eraser. You'll find that as you kind of integrate these shading marks in a vertical fashion in the falling water, you'll need to also then slowly erase certain vertical marks, and this is a great way to emphasize that falling motion within your waterfall landscape, specifically in the falling water. Otherwise, with the actual settled water and still water, it really is a matter of darkening those areas, really trying to create this idea that the water is reflecting the environment around it, which tends to be the kind of tonal value in comparison to crashing water. That still water tends to be quite dark, as it is more capable of becoming a little bit more of a settled mirror-like structure that reflects the environment around it. But as we continue, guys, the intention from this point onward is to build up your tonal values, remembering the difference between the background, the midground, and the foreground, not just in tonal values but also in scale. So there you have it, guys, how to draw a waterfall in a few simple steps. From this point onward, it's simply a matter of building up those tonal values, spending time on the features in the foreground, midground, and background, remembering scale as a way to kind of guide you in terms of deciding on the size of various features. So features will be slightly smaller as they drift towards the background, but they'll also be slightly lighter. So it's also a matter of remembering the actual tonal values in terms of So it's also a matter of remembering the tonal values in terms of defining features that become a little less distinct as they shift towards the background. And then naturally, as the features shift towards the foreground, they become more detailed. But take your time, build up your tonal values. Remember, shading is a way in which we represent shadow formation, which ultimately is what gives three-dimensionality to our drawings, which inevitably will make a drawing more realistic. But take your time with your sketch. If you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below if you'd like us to make more content related to these kinds of topics, natural topics, landscape topics, maybe learning how to draw different types of elements, you name it. Please let us know in the comment section below. And if you did like this video, once again, please do like it and subscribe. This helps us to grow the channel, which ultimately enables us to make more art related content for you guys, which we love. But otherwise, guys, thanks again for tuning in, and that is it from me today. Until next time, cheers.